I feel like Brenda Bowen set the table for this very nicely, but we're going to welcome our next presentation. It's an update from the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, Next Steps. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers, Brian Steed and Tim Davis.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be here. This is our second year presenting at this conference. Last year, we were brand spanking new at this job. I had been appointed in July, and you'd been hired like 2 days before, correct?
Right. Absolutely.
And so it's fun to be back and to talk about some of the things we've been able to do in the Commissioner's Office. By way of reminder, the Commissioner's Office is a relatively new creation. It happened as a result of the low levels we saw in the Great Salt Lake. In 2022, the legislature said, hey, we really need a quarterback position essentially for Great Salt Lake, and that's how we got involved in this. Last year during this symposium, we were very, very, very worried because we had a very short time frame to get together a strategy on how the state was going to respond to the crisis on Great Salt Lake and put forward a strategy on what steps we could take going forward. And so that's what we worked on. That was our Thanksgiving last year. We're happy to be here and report on where we are now and given where we were then. So just as a start and a reminder, the Great Salt Lake is such an iconic landscape. It's a place that defines not only how we name ourselves, but also in large measure how we identify ourselves. And I really appreciate the words of Brenda Bowen at the beginning on how cool it is that we get to live here and work on these issues. They really are special, and I think that we connect with that place in a more than a scientific way. I think it's personal. And I think that's a really nice reminder. Where we are today on Great Salt Lake, as of 3 days ago, we're sitting essentially where we started in 2021. Why that's significant is because, well, that was only a year before we saw those record lows. While that statistic is a little discouraging, I can say two things that are really not discouraging. One, we are in a very different place than we were policy-wise in 2021, and we have a variety of other tools that we can employ in making sure that we don't dip down into those low lake levels. Secondly, interestingly, we have learned a lot in those last 2 years on how we can manage the lake and manage salinity levels to make sure that we maintain a healthy ecosystem in addition to healthy lake levels. Jim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think in 2021, Brian wasn't appointed yet, so but we also hadn't really kicked into, the legislature of the state hadn't kicked into gear to understand the crisis that was coming. In 2022, 2023, the legislature of the state really developed new tools that we have been spending the last year really implementing and building off the work that many of you have been doing and your agencies had already been doing to try to get more water to the lake, to try to put into place actions that we can take if the lake begins to fall where it did in 2022 to its lowest recorded level.
The second thing I'd just say in terms of the good news is that we're in a very different state of water from where we were trending into 2021 to where we had experienced just years and years of drought and that declining lake levels to where the lake was only rising by a foot even during the runoff years. We think that because we've had 2 good years, we can expect a healthy runoff even if we're below average this year on our water cycle, and that's, I think, helpful. Similarly, from the human standpoint, our reservoirs are much, much fuller than they were, and so if we do get water this year and those atmospheric rivers come through, which we all hope and pray they do, if they do, we're able to then not only capture that water for our water storage, but also spill a lot of that water to where it needs to be in Great Salt Lake.
So during those last few years, this is and I'm looking for Christine Rumsey, so USGS.
There she is, right there.
During the last years, you could see salt levels spike as the lake levels went down. Salt levels right now are in a fairly healthy range going into the winter. So it's significantly different than where we were in the past. There's evidence that significant amount of salt mass has been exported from the south arm to the north arm.
And from an ecology standpoint, this is actually good news for 2 reasons as well. One, this is a healthy range now for brine shrimp and brine flies. In the fall of 2022, all of us were very worried when it came to that ecological productivity. It's a big deal. Secondly, I would just say that we've learned a valuable lesson in that there are management tools that we can employ to actually make sure that there are less salinity levels on the south arm, and that is with the causeway berm, and that's something that we learned over time on how we managed and kept more water, more fresh water on the south arm and brought those salinity levels down. It's not a management tool we hope to employ, just being very candid, but it's a management tool we can employ if necessity requires, and that's something I think that is an important lesson.
So in the Great Salt Lake strategic plan that we were working on over Thanksgiving last year, there were 4 main objectives. It's a 30-year plan, 3 different timeframes. First of those objectives is better coordination. And luckily, over this last year, we've seen the state has signed an MOU with our federal partners to ensure that we're able to coordinate better going forward. The Sentinel landscape was designated for the Great Salt Lake by the Department of Defense. And just this last couple weeks, there have been tours. Brian went to Mono Lake, Owens Lake with Laura Vernon. Laura organized the trip, so thank you, Laura. And learning from our partners in other states and what they've been able to accomplish, what struggles they've had, and in some ways, what lessons we do not want to repeat here in Utah, in California. And then I was able to go learn from our international partners, especially about Lake Urmia in Iran, and bringing those lessons back.
In terms of those lessons, I think the most crucial lesson we can all learn here is that remediation is a very costly affair, especially when it comes to remediation on dust. If we learn from the example of California on Owens Lake, for instance, Owens Lake was intentionally dried up in order to provide water to the city of Los Angeles. As a result of that, the city of Los Angeles has now been forced to engage in dust remediation. That dust remediation to date has cost the city of Los Angeles $2.6 billion at least. They spend $100 million a year just on controlling the dust. And this is in an area that is 1/16th, maybe even 1/17th the size of the Great Salt Lake. Similarly, it is also an area where there are very few people living around it, unlike our Great Salt Lake, where we have about 3 million people living in close proximity. It shows that if we go the wrong way, remediation can be a very, very, very costly affair, something that we really need to get ahead of in order not to have those consequences. The best way to get ahead of those is to get wet water on the lake, and that's what we're striving to do.
The other thing that the second objective in the strategic plan was make sure that we're making decisions for the lake based on the best available science. And if we don't have that science, that we make new investments in 3 areas where we've seen new investment from the Commissioner's Office, from the Division of Water Resources and others, are in brine, and the Division of Wildlife Resources are better understanding brine flies. In 2022, brine flies largely disappeared when the lake hit its lowest recorded level ever, and they play a crucial role for species, especially the 10 to 12 million birds that rely upon the lake. So we need to understand them better. Understanding groundwater and the inflows, the role that groundwater plays to the lake levels, salinity, and then lastly, airborne snow observation. We need better science and understanding of where the snowpack is, how much snow water equivalent is there, and then help our water managers be able to make better decisions, make good decisions when we have enough snow to get to the lake.
And in terms of getting water to the lake, obviously this is the real important part of the Commissioner's plan going forward. We do need to get more water to the lake. We've been working very closely with the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, as well as developing voluntary agreements with a variety of partners to make sure that we can get more water to the lake. We are just starting this process, and so I can't say that we are where we need to be. I can't say we have made actual real progress on this, and one of the things we'll be pursuing over the next year is leasing agreements on water with those that have water, whether that's in the municipal and industrial context or in the agricultural context, and getting that water then dedicated and delivered to the lake. Lastly, just to point out, we have 2 new staff that's dedicated to doing that. One is here. So that's Aspen, Johnston. Aspen is hired as Mikey here as well. I don't think so.
No.
Just the Lone Ranger. Working full-time to make sure that we can go out and interact with water rights holders and make those negotiations happen. This is working in conjunction with the Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust and working as an additive layer of that and not as a replacing layer.
So as Brian was talking about, the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, the Commissioner's Office, and then Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. This is just we've had around 70,000 acre feet dedicated to the lake over in the last year. Some of those are permanent, some of those are 1 year, some of those are multi-year. We won't go into too much detail here, but
I do think this is meaningful. I mean, think about where we were 2 years ago, where we really didn't have any water, and even 5 years ago when there was no legal mechanism to have water dedicated to the lake. You think about this now, just in relatively, just in terms of water law, short time frame, we're actually making pretty sizable progress. And also keep in mind that we work in a very conservative state. Even in a conservative state, we can see progress in this space, and I think that's something that you all ought to be congratulated for. Because this is not just something the Commissioner's Office is doing, or something that the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust is doing. It's something that all of us as society have a role in communicating with your friends and neighbors and making sure that people understand the need, as well as the opportunities that are out there.
So in the last piece, and it's the red line, is there was new legislation for the state to negotiate voluntary agreements with mineral extraction companies from the lake. The first of those agreements was signed this year with Compass Minerals and the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. That would change how Compass Minerals diverted and depletes water from the lake so that those depletions are based on the actual health of the lake itself. So it's significant change over the last year.
And if I can add some color to that, on the front side, going forward, one of the things we were all concerned with is if you get water to the lake and you have industries that work around the lake, then divert that water out of the lake for minerals, that was a problem. One of the things Compass agreed as part of this agreement is to give up 200,000 acre feet of water that they will not pursue going forward. This is water that they hadn't developed, but they now will not develop based on this agreement. Secondly, if the water level at the Great Salt Lake is below 4195, they will take half of the wet water that they've been using traditionally. That's a big deal. It's 40+ thousand feet at least.
70.
And
yeah.
Upwards of 70 of what it could be, and that's water that stays in the lake and benefits the lake and its ecosystem.
Do you want to take?
Lastly, and I'll talk about this, one of the things we're all concerned about is the proximity the lake has and the proximity of a drying lake bed with the huge population center we have here. We are right now under monitored as well as under aware. And I saw Kevin Perry here earlier. I don't know where he went. Kevin, where are you at? Oh, there he is. We've been working very closely with Dr. Kevin Perry at the University of Utah and other experts to make sure that we understand what the needs are with regards to the dust. And Dr. Perry's been working on a study that shows what lake levels we need to be at in order to cover dust hotspots, but also we need to understand that relationship between that drying lake bed and where dust comes from. So we've actually had a bunch of investment this year on Great Salt Lake dust monitoring and research. We need to have more of that. And then in addition to that, we've been working very hard on with the Division of Environmental Quality, or the Department of Environmental Quality, trying to figure out where we need to be in terms of salinity, what those safe levels are. Tim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and the Division of Water Quality is working right now on establishing a salinity limit for discharges to the Great Salt Lake from mineral extraction companies when the lake is already at peril, when the salinity levels are similar to where we were, I'll just say around 15%, and similar to where the lake got to as we were going into 2022. So they'll be establishing, they're directed by law to establish that salinity limit by, I believe, June next year, 2025.
So the next aspect is one of the things that we were required to do as part of our strategy is to come up with a more operational plan by this fall. So in the next month or so, we'll be finalizing what we're calling the 2034 plan. There's two reasons why 2034. One, it's a mere 10 years away. Two, something really special is happening in 2034 you might be aware of that will bring the eyes of the world to this valley. And bringing the eyes of the world to this valley, I think, is something that I think should motivate all of us to put our best foot forward. Interestingly, when I look back on the previous Olympics, whether it's Beijing or whether it's Paris, environmental issues got a lot of attention on this. I think we are starting what we call our own choose your own adventure here on how the world is going to report on Salt Lake Valley. And we personally think that there's ways that we can improve. And so on this 2034 plan, it's to get us to a healthier level of the lake by that period of time. So we have some guiding principles as part of this. First is do no harm. We have to start making policy choices right now to make sure that we're not harming Great Salt Lake. Two, we need to increase measuring and monitoring. There has been a ton of great work done on measuring and monitoring, but on a lake the size of Great Salt Lake, you'd be surprised to know how little data we have on certain key areas. And so getting that data in those key areas I think is really important. Three, we have to realize that all of us, whether you live like I do in Cache County or whether we live here in Salt Lake, we're all in this together. As a Great Salt Lake watershed, we all have risks to be borne, and so this is really important that we all work together on that. Next, we need to make sure that we focus on those major policy levers. And those major policy levers can be a variety of things, but especially we need to maximize wet water years and getting water to the lake on those wet water years. And so that's something I think that we need to do. Similarly, we need to work with those with water rights and make sure that they're incentivized to providing more of that water, dedicating it, delivering to the lake. Finally, as a guiding principle, we need to be iterative and adaptive. I'm not here to say that I know all the answers. Tim maybe does have the answers. I trust him for that. But the reality is all of us are learning as we go on this process. It's really important that we don't screw it up. So as we learn lessons, we need to adapt. We need to make sure that we maximize what works. We need to minimize what doesn't work and do better. Lastly, I'll just say this. Any solution for Great Salt Lake has to meet 5 really important principles. Tim, do you want to go through those?
So these are the same principles that we called out in the Great Salt Lake Strategic Plan. Solutions need to be ecologically sustainable, economically viable, politically possible, technically feasible, and then our lawyers made us put the last one in.
True,
so we'll just leave that. And you know, for the Commissioner's Office, we're really focusing. There are a lot of great ideas. There are a lot of aspirational, there are a lot of hopes for the lake. There are a lot of things that people wish we could do tomorrow that do not meet these criteria. So we're focused on how do we make progress on the lake in a way that our political betters can get behind, that we can actually fund, and that will be sustainable over time. We don't want to just do this. We can't, and this is one of the lessons learned from the other lakes that we talked about, is we can't just do this once. We have to do this always. I mean, it's a long-term solution, not a short-term solution, and then it has to be technically feasible, whatever we come up with. So the other piece of this is, and we're talking about those major levers, this is the long-term trend of the lake elevation. It's a downward trend since 1902. So the first of the levers that the 2034 plan it talks about is establishing a target for baseline increased inflows to the lake. If we're not able to accomplish that, then the lake will continue to go down. And this is a model run by Dr. Tarbotton at Utah State. And this shows what will happen in the future if that long-term trend will continue, and the lake levels will continue to be primarily in those severe adverse effects and adverse effect levels. But if we're able to get 250,000 acre-feet more dedicated and delivered to the lake every year by 2030, we can for the first time, take that downward trend and have an inflection point where that trend begins to go up. We start to fill the lake again. And that is again, those 5 criteria, we think that is hard. It's a significant amount, but it's achievable. And so, but it'll take work from all of us. It'll take a lot of work from Aspen, but a lot of work from all of us, significant investments from the state, federal partners and others, to be able to get an extra 250,000 acre-feet into the lake by 2030, every year going forward from there.
The next tool, just really quickly, is monitoring that causeway berm breach, or the breach in the causeway, to make sure that we manage that berm and that we can utilize it to control salinity if needed. Hopefully we don't have to get there, but that's a tool that's available, and it seemed to be effective on the last go-round.
And then, as Brian said earlier, the last of those 3 big levers are making sure we take advantage of big water years. When we have a lot of snow, work with water conservancy districts, work with other entities that store water within the Great Salt Lake Basin, and make sure that we're getting those big flows to the lake when they make the biggest difference to the lake. And these are the years where no one else is sacrificing that. If we do this, if we can get the lake as high as possible during big water years, that buffers us when we go back into drought.
Lastly, in the last 20 seconds before we take questions, this is something that's going to require some intentionality on our part. It's not enough just to conserve. We also have to conserve and then dedicate that water and deliver it to the lake. We've done relatively well over the last 3 years on that first part. In fact, I would say, given where we were maybe 5 years ago, we've done remarkably well. The last two portions, something we really need to work on, and making sure that we get more water to the lake when it needs to be there is something we'll be working on, and it's something we're dedicated to do. I would also say this, for you all in this room, this is your call to action. Because ultimately, this is going to require all of us and all of our dedicated attention to get it right. If you have ideas or things that you know as water managers and smarter people than we are to get this in a better position, please let us know. We're happy to innovate. We're happy to adapt our plans, and we're happy to make sure that we get the water that needs to be to the lake. With that, we will take whatever questions you might have. Thanks. And apparently there's microphones out there somewhere. And I've been promised if you really want to, you can sing karaoke as well.
Just curious about your discussion about the mineral company and how they decided to not take so much water. Are there different technologies or developments that they implemented so that they wouldn't have to use as much water?
In some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. This was just an intentional decision based on their desire to be a good partner with the lake.
Okay.
I'm assuming that you've had discussions regarding what you found out about Owens Lake and the amount of money they're spending to mitigate dust, et cetera. I'm wondering, when you talk with policymakers, whether it's people at the state legislature or maybe just water district managers or whoever, what's their reaction when they hear that? And what is that the thing that you get the most traction with, or are there other arguments that gain you more traction?
So it's an interesting question. In terms of one of the motivating factors certainly has been dust. People are genuinely nervous about it. And when you see those big dust events come off the lake bed, you can totally see why. It's something that if you live here in the valley, you've seen happen, and it causes alarm. I can't say that's always been a motivating factor for policymakers. I think that maybe what is more of a motivating factor is the regulatory mechanisms that follow something like a big dust event or an ESA listing or an Endangered Species Act listing. And those levers do actually motivate policymakers to sit up and take notice. That would require a large reorganization of how we deliver water in the state, and that's something that makes people nervous. Tim, you want to add anything?
No, I mean, along those same lines, I think one of the conversations that Brian and I have regularly with state leaders is, we have the opportunity now as Utahns to solve this for ourselves. We don't need the federal government to come in and solve this for us. We can do this, but we have to be intentional about it. We all have to conserve, dedicate, and deliver water to get it to the lake. But if we don't do that, that's where we may reach non-attainment for air quality. And there is a petition that was filed for listing the Wilson's phalarope as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So we have an opportunity now to solve this for ourselves, and we need to take it.
Todd Stonley, no questions from government, sorry. No, go ahead.
You said that you need to get about 250,000 acre-feet of water to the lake, reduce depletions from essentially from human uses. And you talked about mineral extraction being one of those. What about the other big three, the M&I, agriculture, and man-made wetlands? If you could address that, I'd appreciate it.
So we're looking for a 10% reduction in water use across those sectors. Is about what it takes. And if you talk about a 10% reduction in M&I, on our way in today, we were driving just through the valley here, and we were noticing a lot of non-functional turf. There was a presentation yesterday before the legislature that showed about 150,000 acres of turf in the Great Salt Lake watershed. If you watered that just what it needs to be watered versus what people think it needs to be watered, That's a pretty substantial reduction in water and actually gets a fair amount of water to the lake as long as we dedicate and deliver it to the lake. Now, what does that mean, watering it how it needs to? Well, I don't have the exact numbers on that, but there are experts in this room, I guarantee, that can tell you how much you need to be watering your grass and identifying areas of grass in your own yards or gardens that are non-functional. And by non-functional, I mean areas that you may only walk on once a week when you mow it. That's pretty definitional as being something you probably don't need. As a similar metric to that, interestingly, and I worked with the Weber County Water Conservancy District some years ago, who were doing an analysis of where big water users were. They actually did a study, found one of the areas that they were observing was a park strip in front of a restaurant. It was a fast food joint, I don't remember which kind it was, that was delivering about 700 inches of water per year on their park strip. They would be by far better to grow rice in that park strip than they would Kentucky bluegrass. And it's that sort of mindfulness and being aware that I think helps. On the agriculture side as well, we have done a lot of investments in water optimization for agriculture. We are now in the process of starting negotiations with those farmers and ranchers on temporary leases or like seasonal leases for different areas, as well as seasonal leases within farms and ranches.
Yeah, and I think one of the keys, and this will be in the 2034 plan, is that we're not just looking, it's unproductive to look at just one sector or another. It's if everyone can conserve, dedicate, and deliver 10%, cut their depletions by 10%, and dedicate and deliver that to the lake, we can get to this short-term goal where we get an inflection point where we begin to fill the lake again. But if we don't, and we are unable to make those contributions, we're not able to work together, then that inflection point becomes that much harder over time. So, really, we're looking at all sectors, all water users to take that step.
And our timekeeper went away, so I have no idea how much time we have.
He did run away.
We'll just maximize the time at this point. Why don't we go over here?
Yeah, sorry, just we do want to cut this off after 2 more questions, I would say, and we'll move to our break.
If you're in line afterwards, come talk to us. We'll answer your question. It just won't have the audience. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. What is the state of Utah doing with the states of Wyoming and Idaho maintaining Bear River flows?
We are working with the states of Idaho and Wyoming to make sure they understand the risks that are associated with Great Salt Lake, as well as they understand the benefits of conservation. This is a beginning of the conversation. I will tell you straight up, there are a lot of people in Idaho that don't necessarily see this as an Idaho problem. They see this very much as a Utah problem, similarly in Wyoming. We're trying very hard to make sure that they understand if there are those regulatory events, whether through Endangered Species Act or even potentially dust, a federal court will reach across state boundaries. And that's something that people have to understand because it's not just a Utah problem.
Thank you.
This is a follow-up question on that 250,000 acre feet. The other 2 kind of moving targets with that are population growth and precipitation trends in a drying, warming world. And so as you've done that calculation, is there a kind of a triple inflection point where those 3 come together that is going to create another management challenge down the road?
So the modeling that was done to see what the impact that 250,000 looked at the last 25 years, because those are the warmest on record. Those are also times when we've seen changes, the precipitation that we may see going forward. So we're trying to take that into consideration at least in the short term, that next 25 years, rather than trying to guess what is going to happen with temperature and precipitation. Look at we didn't look all the way back in the record. We tried to look at recent history to develop those models. And then if you look at growth, if you look at municipal industrial water use, as the state has grown and as the growth has taken place within the Great Salt Lake Basin, M&I water use has largely stayed flat and actually tipped down a little bit.
Depletions.
On depletions. So there's actually somewhat of a decoupling from growth, from human growth, municipal industrial growth, and water use. They're not tracking the way they had before. So we will be, and we just talked with the Legislative Water Development Commission last night, we need to be having a conversation as how do we grow, how do we conserve in a way that conserves for growth and for the lake? That we, if we're not having those conversations together, then we're not going to be successful at protecting the lake and being able to grow into the future.
And I'll give you just one off-the-cuff remark. We are seeing increased or maintaining demand. We are seeing decreasing supply. We're going to have to make up that gap.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Okay.